Occupational Skills Coalition, and this webinar is going to be a basic overview about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and Federal Workforce Development Policy in general. So let's just go ahead and get started with a little bit of an overview. So people talk about the Federal Workforce Development System like it actually is a thing, but it definitely means different things to different people and involves a lot of different stakeholders. So if you sort of are trying to understand all of the different players, I've given some examples of some of the key actors in the workforce development system, probably in your state. So the State Workforce Investment Board, which is typically an office inside the governor's office that generally oversees state workforce development policy, and that can cut across a lot of different programs and agencies. Your State Department of Labor, there's a series of local boards as well, local workforce investment boards that generally focus on implementation and program management under what used to be called the Workforce Investment Act and is now called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Your State Adult Education Agency, which sometimes is your State Department of Labor, but also sometimes is in the State Department of Education. Community colleges and other post-secondary education providers, where we see more and more occupational technical training occurring. There are other agencies that are often involved with workforce development, including your state HHS office, USDA, which is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has jurisdiction over the SNAP Employment and Training Program, so your state SNAP agency may play a role in your state workforce development system. And then there are a bunch of other stakeholders, including community-based organizations that are running apprenticeships, including unions, career and technical education providers, which can be secondary or post-secondary education providers, industry partnerships, which tend to be employer-led, but there are other types of workforce intermediaries as well. And then there's also often an important role for philanthropy, which helps support a lot of this work. And these are just some of the key stakeholders. There may be other stakeholders in your state or local community that are equally important to the way workforce services are delivered. But the general takeaway, I hope, is for people to really understand that it's a very wide-ranging system and involves a lot of actors in a lot of different capacities. There are a number of federal workforce development programs, just as there are a lot of stakeholders involved. And again, there's probably not one single answer when you ask people, well, what are the key federal workforce development programs? It sort of depends on how you define workforce and job training programs. In 2012, GAO, there was a GAO report that actually talked about 47 programs across 9 agencies. I think in general people thought that this was not a good list of programs. They define the programs as those that have their primary focus as job training, but they included, for example, TANF on that list, where we know that the primary mission of TANF is not job training. It's really an income support program. Less than 10% of TANF funding goes to education and training. So probably not necessarily appropriate to include TANF on the list. And they did not include the Higher Education Act, even though about half of all students in community colleges are receiving occupational or technical training. So I think there was a general sense that this GAO list was not right. But how do we get a clear alternative where people really understand what federal programs are considered job training programs? I think it depends on who you talk to. There's probably some agreement on a set of core programs, including the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Current Technical Education, the Pell Grant Program, Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, Veterans Training Programs, Youth Build, and SNAP E&T, which is the Employment and Training Program for people who are receiving food stamps or SNAP benefits. I think in general, if you talk to people, they would probably say, yes, those are job training programs. But there are a number of other programs as well, including programs administered by Housing and Urban Development. There are programs in the Department of Energy. There are programs in the Department of Transportation. There There are programs at HHS, all of which have job training components, but are not typically probably widely considered as common job training programs. So really it depends a little bit on your point of view, the population that you're serving, and the type of industry that you are focusing on. I am going to focus most of my remarks today, though, on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, which is largely considered, I think, as the primary federal job training program. WIOA was just recently signed by the President in July of this year. It reauthorizes the Workforce Investment Act, or WIA, which was created in 1998 as the primary job training program in the United States. It sort of created and funds the federal infrastructure for how people access and receive job training services. It had not previously been reauthorized, so we were working under the legislation from 1998. So for 16 years, the same legislation, so it was no small accomplishment to actually have the program recently reauthorized, and it probably does create some important opportunities for people who are interested in workforce development and job training as we go forward. But WIOA, like WIA, consists of 4 titles. Title I, which is an occupational training title. Title II, which is the Adult Education and Family Literacy title. Title III, which is the Wagner-Peiser or Employment Services title. And this is the title III is the state employment services, authorizes the state employment services, which focus on things like unemployment insurance, labor market information, job matching, and rapid reemployment services for people who have been laid off or otherwise become unemployed. And then Title IV is vocational rehabilitation title and focuses primarily on serving people living with disabilities. And that is unchanged from WIA to WIOA. Titles I and Title III, so the occupational training title and the Wagner-Peiser employment services title, are run by the Department of Labor. And Titles II and IV are run by the Department of Education, so the Adult Ed and Family Literacy, which also provides ESL and civics education services for English speakers of other languages, and Title IV, the vocational rehabilitation title, are out of the Department of Education, which does cause confusion and complication to have 2 different agencies with jurisdiction over different parts of the legislation. And then to create even more confusion, within each of the titles, there are dozens and dozens of programs that are authorized within each title. So, for example, in Title I, Job Corps is authorized, Migrant and Seasonal Farm Workers is authorized, Native American programs are authorized, a number of other occupational training programs are all authorized inside of Title I, and the same is true for each of the 4 titles. So you wind up with a bunch of programs across 4 titles in 2 agencies, all authorized under the same legislation. When most people talk about WIOA, though, what they're really talking about is Title I, the occupational training title. And this really is the place where you see the bulk of occupational or sort of skill, technical or skill-oriented training programs authorized and funded. And that's what we're going to focus on for the next few minutes. So the basic structure of WIOA Title I, or the occupational training title, is a highly devolved program. It's really a locally run program, and that's reflected in the funding structure. So the money flows from the federal government out of the Department of Labor to the state. The state takes 15% off the top, but 85% of the funding that goes to the state is passed through to the local level, where it's managed by local workforce investment boards that are responsible for running what are called now called American Job Centers. They're more commonly known as one-stop centers. But the primary function of WIA Title I is to support, run, and manage the American Job Centers through the workforce investment boards. And the idea is that job seekers can access career services or training services through the American Job Centers. And this is actually a change that occurred under the recent reauthorization. It used to be the case that individuals could receive one of 3 types of services, what were called core services, which were the sort of lightest touch lowest level of services where maybe you were referred to a resource room for job search or something like that. If you failed to find employment through core services, then you could move on to intensive services, which were slightly more robust services, things like maybe some skills assessment or resume writing services. Still relatively light touch, though. And if you failed to find employment after you received intensive services, then an individual could go on to try and receive some training services. So it was sequential, and it was often very difficult to ever get to training services. That has been changed now, and there are just two categories. So instead of core, intensive, and training services, now there are just career services and training services. And career services can include skills assessment, self-service access to job listings, information about careers and local labor market conditions, career counseling, development of individual employment plans, short-term vocational services or pre-vocational services, internships or work experience, and English language acquisition services. Training services tend to be more intensive services, and they're available to individuals who are either unlikely or unable to obtain or retain employment through the lighter touch career services. And training services can include activities such as occupational skills training, on-the-job training, which actually includes wages or a salary, job readiness training, and adult education and literacy activities if they're provided in conjunction with job training activities. And they've eliminated the requirement that these services be provided sequentially. So an individual could come into an American Job Center, receive assessment, and be placed directly into skills training if there's a determination made that that's going to be the thing that's going to be the most likely to help them succeed in obtaining employment. There are a number of mandatory partners in the state workforce development delivery system through the local WIBs and in the one-stop centers. So WIOA includes a requirement. It lists the mandatory partners in the legislation, and they include TANF, HUD-funded employment and training programs, and Second Chance Act programs, which are programs that serve ex-offenders. The SNAP Employment and Training Program is an optional partner as well, but the idea is that all of these providers are supposed to be co-located in in an American Job Center, hopefully to create and strengthen a no-one-door approach so that an individual coming in looking for employment, whatever program that they're authorized services under, they should be able to find and access those services through an American Job Center. And this is going to be important. We're going to come back to talk about this, but the fact that a number of programs that focus on public benefit recipients and other low-skilled or low-wage workers are mandatory partners should hopefully increase the voice and the role of those partners in how the system operates going forward. So under WIOA Title I, there are actually three main programs or funding streams. There's a program that is targeted to adults, individuals over age 18, and this program is supposed to prioritize services for low-income individuals. There's not a lot of evidence that this is actually happening, and there are some reasons for that, but it is meant to provide services to particularly low-income individuals who wouldn't qualify for services under any of the other funding streams. There's a funding stream for dislocated workers. So these are individuals who have been laid off or who have received notice that they're going to be laid off, individuals who are eligible for UI or who have used up all their UI benefits, and displaced homemakers also qualify for services under the dislocated worker funding stream. And then the third funding stream is one that focuses on youth. There were some significant changes made to this program in the recent reauthorization, including expanding the age range of individuals who can be served through the program. So now it covers individuals between 14 and 24. There's also a significant new focus on out-of-school youth. So 75% of funding under the youth funding stream will now be required to go to out-of-school youth, which previously under WIA, the requirement was that 30% of funding went to out-of-school youth. So So this will be a very significant change in the way services are delivered for youth and who is targeted for those services. WIOA is considered what's called a universal program. So really, in theory, anybody who walks through the door should be able to access services. More than 8 million people received WIOA Title I funded services in program year 2012, which is more than triple the number of people who received services in program year 2007. So the program really has expanded dramatically in recent years, despite the fact that funding has been significantly cut during that same time period, which has created problems, and you'll see it in these numbers. So even though more than 8 million people received some type of Title I funded services, the reality is that most of those people probably got some sort of very light touch services. Maybe they got some basic information or were referred to a reference room where they were able to use a computer to look at job listings or something like that. But for the most part, the vast majority of people who come into a one-stop center are not enrolled in WIOA and are probably not receiving very robust services. And you can see of the 8 million people who received some type of service in 2012, just over 1 million of them formally exited the program, which means that they were enrolled, they received some type of services, and then they were formally exited out of the program, having essentially completed whatever services they were receiving. So there's a significant number of people who receive some type of services through WIOA, but they're in all likelihood very limited services. But even of those who receive, who are formally enrolled and who actually exit the program, of that 1.1 million, of those exiters, only about 115,000 of them receive training services. So if you think about that, of the 8 million people who walked into a one-stop or an American Job Center to receive services, only a tiny, tiny fraction of them were able to actually receive training services through an American Job Center. So WIOA and public benefit recipients, this is, you can probably guess from the last slide, a very small percentage of people who go in seeking services are receiving any kind of rigorous or robust services. And public benefit recipients are very unlikely to actually be receiving services through WIOA. And there are reasons for this, which we're going to talk about. But there is an effort to change this. There's a growing understanding that we have to do a better job. The workforce development field understands this. I think people on the public benefit side understand that a job, a decent, stable job is key to helping people move towards economic self-sufficiency. And we've got to figure out a better way to sort of connect those two conversations. In part because of just the reality of the labor market and what work looks like in this country. So, for example, we know that 2/3 of job openings in the next decade will require some education or training past high school. It's just going to be very, very difficult for individuals to even really enter the labor market without some sort of post-secondary education. And this trend is just going to get, worse over time. I think policymakers do understand that, it's not enough to say to public benefit recipients that they should be working and to really, make it as hard as possible for individuals to receive public benefits and try and force them off the rolls to just say, go get a job. It's just not a realistic solution for individuals with barriers, particularly people who lack previous access to education and training. It just has to be a part of the policy solution to help public benefit recipients move more towards economic self-sufficiency. The challenge then, I think because we do have more agreement on sort of what needs to happen, I think the challenge now is how to make that happen. How do we best meet the needs of low-skilled or low-wage workers? And there's a lot of attention and a lot of focus to this, and I think the conversation would benefit greatly by having people who focus on the public benefits side be more a part of this conversation. So, as I said, WIOA has generally not done a very good job of serving low-skilled individuals. And I think, we have a pretty good sense of why not. So historically, WIOA, which was passed in 1998, so 2 years after welfare reform, it did adopt that sort of work-first philosophy that was characteristic of TANF. It was from that same historical era and used that same model of, any job is better than no job, and people are going to do better if we just put them into the labor market as fast as we can rather than allow them to stay on any kind of public assistance. So it has, for many years, WIA and now WIOA was very much focused on rapid attachment to the labor market, and any job was better than no job. There were also a set of performance measures under WIA that really pushed away from serving highly barriered individuals, so there was a lot of attention to placement and earnings and retention. And when you pair that with a rapid reattachment model, it was, somebody who was going to need a lot of services over a long period of time just to get into a relatively low-wage job. To be just very frank, was not a good bet for a training provider who was being held accountable for these performance measures. The performance measures under WIOA have been changed now, hopefully to begin to address some of this, including using weighted performance measures now. So there's a regression model to take into consideration both an individual's characteristics as well as characteristics of local labor markets to weight the performance measures. So hopefully there will be less of an incentive to cream barriered individuals out. There's also a new measure of basic skills gains or progress towards basic skills gains or a credential. And the intent of that was to create a longer timeline for serving individuals who are highly barriered. Somebody who starts out as a very low-level learner who's at a very low literacy level, for example, it could take quite a long time. There may be a lot of pre-vocational services or work readiness services that individual needs. There may be some basic literacy service that individual needs that are just going to be necessary before they're even ready to enter into the labor market. So hopefully this new measure of progress towards basic skills or employment will allow for a longer time horizon and recognize that there are some individuals who you might be providing very intensive services for who are just not going to meet some of the other traditional employment measures for a while. And then the other issue has been funding, and job training or workforce development funding has been really decimated in the last decade, which of course the funding cuts have accelerated under the Budget Control Act, under the budget caps and the sequester cuts. We've lost more than $1 billion since 2010 out of about $6 billion total for key job training programs. So these cuts have had a pretty severe effect on the ability of job training providers to provide intensive services or costly or long-term services. And many providers have sort of been forced to adopt what I would call like a triage model. Because again, if you go back to the fact that WIA, or now WIOA, is a universal program, anybody who comes through the door is supposed to be receiving services, which makes it very difficult to focus on people who are going to need longer-term, higher-cost, more intensive services. I've had people describe it to me as, you can run a storefront that serves 100 people moderately well, or you can run a boutique that serves 10 people very well, and neither one of those is an ideal option. But because it is a universal system, because providers are required to meet the needs of to try and meet the needs of anybody who comes through the doors, we tend to get more of a storefront and a boutique approach, where those who are most highly in need of the most intensive, costly services are probably the least likely to get what they need. There are a lot of opportunities, though, under WIOA in particular. As I have mentioned, there's a growing understanding that we can't afford to ignore any potential workers. The Center on Education and the Workforce actually estimates that at the present rate by 2020, the U.S. will lack 5 million workers with the post-secondary skills and credentials necessary to meet labor market demands. And what this tells education and training providers is that we can't sort of pick and choose who we're going to help. We really have to make sure that everybody who's in the labor market has the skills that they need to meet the skilled worker needs that employers and that our economy are demanding. And that means serving all workers and making sure that all workers at all skill levels are getting the services that they need to succeed as the economy changes. And toward this end, there are a number of best practices, new best practices that we're seeing come up in the field. They've really accelerated in, I'd say, the last 5 to 7 years. So we're seeing a lot of attention now to things like career pathways, which are these very well-designed career pathway tends to have a series of stacked or linked credentials so that individuals can enter in and out of the labor market, combine education and learning, paired with very intensive supportive services, and tend to be targeted towards lower skilled learners. Bridge programs that target very low skilled learners, integrated or contextualized models that combine adult basic education or ESL with occupational training. This is a change from old sequential models to now simultaneous models, and we have clearly seen better outcomes for individuals. People are more successful. There are fewer leakage points when we adopt these integrated or contextualized models. What's called chunk courses, which is to take longer-term courses and break them up into smaller bits for people who are trying to combine work and learning, or who can only tackle things in little bites. And earn and learn approaches, which we know are important, particularly for low-income learners who literally just can't afford to step out of the labor market to do full-time education and training. So we're trying to develop more and more ways for people to combine work and learning and actually get work experience as part of their occupational training. We know all of these models are better suited to individuals with barriers to employment, and there's more and more focus, and there's a better and better understanding of these models in recent years. There's definitely a role, I think, for people who focus on public benefits to be part of this conversation. The good news is the workforce development system is more aware of these issues, but it's never a good idea for, sort of one set of stakeholders to think that they have, or to have the only voice in the conversation. And I think we would greatly benefit on both sides of the conversation for people who work on public benefits and people who work on job training to really work together and have some important conversations about how do we create or expand or develop programs that help people who are receiving public benefits have access to the education and training that's going to let them get a job and move towards economic self-sufficiency. And there's a lot of opportunities, particularly now because of WIOA reauthorization, for people who are interested, who maybe have not been engaged before, to begin to engage in this conversation. So one of the first things that's going to happen is the interim regulations are due out on January 18th, 2015. These are regulations that are being written by the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, and Health and Human Services across all 4 titles of WIOA, including the occupational training title. There will be an opportunity, it's probably a little bit late in the process to try and weigh in at this point before the regulations are published. But once they are published, there will definitely be opportunity. There will be a year-long opportunity for people to provide comment and feedback before the final regulations are published in January of 2016. And I do think it would be really important for people who focus on public benefit recipients to be looking at these regulations to make sure that they're taking into account the needs of low-skilled or low-wage workers. The new performance measures that I mentioned will need to be defined as part of this process. And there is a lot of interest in trying to figure out some of the issues around basic skills gains, for example, and how to make sure that there are no unintended consequences where highly buried individuals or other low skill or low wage workers are not being pushed out of the system because of the performance measures. At the state level, states are going to be required to develop new state plans, either a unified plan, which is a plan that covers all of the programs authorized under WIOA, or a combined state plan, which actually looks beyond the WIOA authorized programs and can include things like TANF, SNAP E&T, HUD-funded employment and training programs, career and technical education, and a number of other federally funded human capital programs. And I do think it's important, again, that individuals, outside of the workforce development system are paying attention to this process. We want it to be as transparent and as accessible as possible, in part because it could have a very direct impact on other programs and individuals being served by other programs, including TANF and SNAP. And I do think that there's going to be a lot of interest in states using this as an opportunity to develop sort of a broad vision for how the state is meeting the skilled workforce needs for employers and the skill needs for workers, so that they can do well for themselves and their families. And I think that there's a very good chance that that those conversations will be broad enough to cover programs outside of the WIOA authorized programs. But even if they focus just on the WIOA authorized programs, individuals living with disabilities, returning vets, ex-offenders, disconnected and low-income youth, low-skilled adults through seeking services through adult basic education or ESL services, all of those people, even if they just focus on WIOA authorized programs, all of those people will be directly influenced by the decisions that are made as part of this, the unified state plans. And so it will be very important for advocates to weigh in as part of that process. There's a ton of new attention under WIOA on career pathways, including the provision of supportive services. And I do think that if that's going to work at all, there's just not enough money under WIOA to make sure that people have access to the supportive services that we know that they need, not just to get access to education and training, but to persist and succeed in education and training. It's just the money's just not there, so states are going to have to figure out ways to link services across programs so that people have both the employment and training services that they need, but also the supportive services they need to succeed. And then there's also a new funding, there's a new requirement under WIOA around how the American Job Centers are funded. So all of the mandatory partners are going to be required to enter into a new MOU, and each of the mandatory partners will be required to contribute at least something to the funding for the operation of the American Job Centers or the one-stop centers. And if the partners are unable to reach an agreement, there is a provision now that the governor can step in and impose a funding agreement on all the partners. So it's really definitely in everyone's best interest to figure out those funding agreements at the local level. And that's going to require some new conversations between the mandatory partners, including TANF and the Second Chance Act programs that serve ex-offenders that probably have not happened in many places before. And I want to add just the point that I do actually think that many education and training providers, many people who are providing employment services, are actually very eager to work with individuals who serve or advocate for people who are receiving public benefits. There's no question that the workforce system has struggled to serve low-skilled workers. It's reflected in the numbers and in the data. But there is definitely growing interest and acknowledgement of the important role in providing services to low-skilled and low-wage workers. And there's a lot of conversations going on right now in the workforce community about what to do and how to serve this population. And again, I think the conversation would benefit greatly by making sure that people who are are working with public benefit recipients all the time are part of that conversation. And I do think that the goal should not be to create a separate system for public benefit recipients, which we have seen a little bit of a trend towards that in the past. And first of all, I don't think we have the resources to do that, but I also think that in general people are not well served by being siloed off. We want highly integrated systems. We want access through programs and institutions so that it's easy for individuals to advance. We don't want people to get stuck, say, in an adult basic ed or another remediation system, because if they come out of those programs there, that tends to be a leakage point where we lose people. So rather than creating separate silo programs, I think it's important to make sure that there's adequate capacity and the right kinds of services in existing systems to serve public benefit recipients. At the same time, though, I would say that it is not appropriate to impose programs or program design on workforce providers. Education and training providers have a lot of experience. They tend to know what works, at least for the clientele that they're used to serving. And so, I think that there needs to be give and take on both sides of the conversation to figure out how to build the capacity, how to build the expertise, and how to make sure that public benefit recipients are getting the right kinds of services through the existing system. So anyway, National Skills Coalition has a lot of resources available. This is a very brief overview of the Federal Workforce Development System and WIOA. For those of you who are interested, though, there's a lot more resources available, and we could go into detail on a lot of these programs. So I encourage you to visit National Skills Coalition's website or to sign up for our member email list if you'd like to learn more about education and training, particularly as it relates to individuals who are receiving public benefits. Thanks very much.